Why doesn't anyone recognize me? It started with a minor car accident that knocked me unconscious for maybe 30 seconds. When I woke up in the hospital bed, my boyfriend Armand was standing in the doorway looking confused. I called his name and he turned to the nurse asking who I was and why I knew his name. When I said it was me, he backed away and said his girlfriend was supposed to be in this room. The nurse had to convince him I was telling the truth and he kept staring at me like I was a stranger. My stomach twisted into knots I couldn't untangle. I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror expecting to see bruises or swelling or something that would explain his reaction. I looked exactly the same as always with my brown eyes and the scar on my chin from falling off my bike as a kid. Nothing was different, but Armand wouldn't stop staring at me with this disturbed expression. My mom arrived and the nurse had to point me out to her 3 times before she'd approach. She kept touching my face saying, "What happened to you?" over and over. When I asked what she meant, she just started crying and couldn't explain. She kept saying I looked wrong but wouldn't say how. The fear in her eyes made me want to throw up. The doctor compared my face to my driver's license photo and immediately agreed something was different, even though he couldn't identify what. He ordered a CT scan thinking maybe there was some swelling or subtle injury affecting my appearance. Everything came back normal with no injuries at all beyond mild whiplash. He kept looking between me and my photo saying the bone structure was identical, but I clearly looked like a different person. He had no medical explanation for it, which I kept saying was because I looked the same, and he patted my shoulder condescendingly. I showed Armand some old selfies and took a new one to compare and said, "See? It's the same." But he pointed at my old photo and said, "That's you," then pointed at the new one and said, "That's someone else." I was looking at 2 identical pictures and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. My roommate screamed when I walked into our apartment and threatened to call the police if I didn't leave. I had to show her my driver's license and keys and recite details only I would know before she'd believe it was me. She kept saying my face was completely different but couldn't describe how. She just said everything is wrong and started sleeping at her boyfriend's place. I felt so alone I couldn't breathe. At work, security wouldn't let me in because my badge photo didn't match my face. My boss had to come down and even she hesitated before confirming it was me. She suggested I take a few weeks off to heal from the accident, even though I had no visible injuries. My coworkers whispered whenever I walked by and avoided making eye contact. I went to an ophthalmologist thinking maybe the accident had damaged my vision in some specific way that made me see my old face in mirrors. He ran every test he could think of and said my vision was perfect. When I asked him if I looked different from my license photo, he got uncomfortable and said he wasn't qualified to answer that. Even the doctor was scared of me. My friends stopped inviting me places, and when I confronted them, they said being around me made them feel weird. My best friend said looking at me gave her the creeps because I looked like someone wearing my skin. When I asked her to explain, she just shook her head and said she couldn't put it into words, but I wasn't me anymore. I tried everything to figure out what they were seeing, including going to 3 different plastic surgeons for consultations. They all said my face was symmetrical and normal, but when I asked if I matched my photos, they got quiet. One finally said the bone structure was the same, but something else was different that he couldn't medically explain. Armand broke up with me after 2 weeks. He said he couldn't pretend I was the same person. He said kissing me felt like cheating on his real girlfriend who'd disappeared in that accident. When I begged him to tell me what was different about my face, he just said, "You have someone else's eyes," even though they were the same brown they'd always been. I cried until I couldn't see. I started wearing sunglasses and masks everywhere to avoid people's reactions. The grocery store clerk who'd known me for years asked if I was new to the neighborhood. My elderly neighbor, who I'd helped every week, called the police when I tried to bring in her mail saying a stranger was trying to break in. I was disappearing from my own life. 3 months later, I'd lost my job and most of my friends. Even my mom could barely look at me. I spent hours staring in mirrors trying to see what everyone else saw, but it was always just my regular face staring back. I felt like I was going insane, insisting I looked the same when the entire world said I didn't. Then I found a support group online for people with Capgras delusion, except they were the family members of people who'd been in accidents. They all described their loved ones looking exactly the same, but feeling fundamentally wrong to look at. One woman said her daughter's face was technically identical, but something behind it had changed. I was reading through the posts when I found one from Armand describing me. He said his girlfriend had been in a minor car accident and now wore a stranger's face even though photographs showed no difference. The comments all said the same thing had happened to someone they knew, and it always started the same way. Every single case began with a minor accident where the person was unconscious for exactly 30 seconds. My hands went cold when I realized there were hundreds of us, and we all thought we looked exactly the same. I clicked on the first post and started reading through every single story on the forum. My hands shook so bad I had to set my laptop on the desk instead of holding it. The pattern showed up in every post. Someone had a minor accident. They were knocked out for exactly 30 seconds. When they woke up, everyone who loved them saw a stranger wearing their face. The details changed, but the core was always the same. A woman in Ohio described her husband backing away from her hospital bed. A man in Florida talked about his mom crying and saying he looked wrong. A college student in Texas wrote about her roommate calling campus security. I kept scrolling and scrolling until my eyes burned. Every story could have been mine. I found Armand's post again and bookmarked it. Then I read it 3 more times even though each word felt like a knife. He described me perfectly, but said I wasn't me anymore. He talked about how my face was identical in photos, but wrong in person. He said other people agreed with him that something had changed. The comments under his post were full of people saying the same thing happened to their loved ones. I wasn't crazy. This was real and happening to hundreds of people. I created a forum account at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep anyway. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard as I typed out everything. The accident. Armand's reaction. My mom touching my face and crying. The doctor comparing me to my license. My roommate screaming. Security not letting me into work. My boss suggesting I take time off. The ophthalmologist getting uncomfortable. My best friend saying I looked like someone wearing my skin. The plastic surgeons going quiet. Armand breaking up with me. Losing my job. My elderly neighbor calling the police. 3 months of my life falling apart while I looked exactly the same in every mirror. I hit post and sat back feeling like I'd just confessed something huge. Within 20 minutes, 5 people responded. Each one shared a nearly identical timeline. Minor accident. 30 seconds unconscious. Everyone they knew saw a stranger. Lost jobs. Lost relationships. Lost their entire lives. One person said they'd been dealing with it for 8 months. Another said a year. They all said the same thing I'd been thinking. We're not crazy. Something real happened to us. The relief hit me so hard I started crying. Not the scared, confused crying from before. This was different. Someone believed me. Multiple someones. I wasn't alone anymore. I cried harder than I had in weeks, and it felt good instead of terrible. A direct message popped up on my screen. Casey Ricci introduced herself as the forum moderator. She asked if I'd be willing to share specific details for her tracking spreadsheet. She explained she'd been documenting cases for 8 months after it happened to her younger sister. She had data on over 300 people. She wanted to know exact accident circumstances, unconsciousness duration, relationship changes, medical tests, everything. I typed back yes immediately. Someone was taking this seriously enough to track it like real data. Someone was organizing information instead of just sharing stories. I felt grateful in a way I hadn't felt since before the accident. Casey sent me a link to a detailed questionnaire. I spent the entire next day filling it out. Questions about the accident location, time of day, weather conditions, type of impact, medical response time, questions about my relationships before and how each person reacted after, questions about every medical test I'd undergone and what the doctors said, questions about my current living situation, employment status, mental health. The structured format helped me see patterns I'd missed while panicking. Everything connected. The 30-second unconsciousness. The universal reaction from people who knew me before. The lack of reaction from strangers. When I submitted the questionnaire, Casey responded within an hour. She said my case fit the profile perfectly. Every detail matched the pattern she'd been tracking. She scheduled a video call with me for the next evening. During the call, Casey's face filled my laptop screen. She looked normal and friendly, and I wondered if her sister saw something wrong when looking at her. She explained she'd been trying to get researchers interested in studying this thing. She pulled up graphs showing accident locations clustered in certain areas. Charts showing unconsciousness duration always landing at exactly 30 seconds. Data on relationship breakdowns following predictable timelines. The graphs made it look scientific and real instead of like some weird curse. She had documented everything. The data was both validating and scary. This was real. This was documented. This was happening to hundreds of people, and nobody outside our group seemed to care or believe it. Casey mentioned during our call that she'd been in contact with a neurologist named Dr. Ibrahim Holmes. He specialized in facial recognition disorders. He'd expressed interest in studying our group, but needed approval from his university and funding to do real research. She asked if I'd be willing to participate in a study if he got clearance. I said yes before she even finished asking. I was desperate for any scientific explanation that might help people understand what was happening to us. Casey's face got serious, and she warned me that even if we proved this was an observer-side neurological issue, that wouldn't magically fix my relationships. The people who saw me as wrong might never see me as right again. The honesty stung, but I appreciated her not giving me false hope. At least I'd have proof I wasn't lying or crazy. That evening, I received an email from Dr. Holmes directly. He introduced himself and said Casey had given him my contact information. He asked if we could schedule a preliminary consultation. His tone felt professional, but genuinely curious instead of skeptical like the other doctors had been. He wanted to understand what was happening instead of dismissing it. I responded within minutes, offering my availability for the entire next week. The consultation happened over video call 2 days later. Dr. Holmes appeared on screen wearing glasses and sitting in what looked like a university office. He asked detailed questions about the exact timeline of events. He wanted to know specific words people used to describe what seemed wrong about my face. He asked whether strangers reacted differently than people who knew me before the accident. I answered everything as carefully as I could. I tried not to sound desperate for him to have answers, even though I was. Dr. Holmes explained his working hypothesis after I finished answering his questions. He thought the accident somehow disrupted the affective recognition circuits in people who knew me. Their brains could still recognize my face visually and match it to memories, but the emotional response that should come with seeing someone familiar was mismatched or missing. So their conscious mind said this is her, while their emotional brain screamed that something was wrong. He emphasized this was just preliminary and would need extensive testing to confirm. But the idea that the problem was in their brains and not in my actual face made me feel less like a monster for the first time in 3 months. Dr. Holmes leaned forward on the screen and started explaining how the study would work. He said they would attach small sensors to the faces of people who knew me before the accident to measure tiny muscle movements when they looked at photos of me. Eye-tracking cameras would record exactly where their gaze focused and how long they looked at different parts of my face. Then they would compare those readings to how strangers responded to the same photos. If his theory was right, people who knew me before would show normal visual processing, but weird emotional responses in the facial muscles and pupil dilation. The technical words confused me, but the basic idea made sense. Proved that their brains were reacting strangely, not that my face actually changed. I told him I would do any testing he needed and bring in whoever he wanted to study. He nodded and explained the next steps. Before starting any official research, he needed to write a proposal for his university's ethics board, called an IRB. They reviewed all studies involving human subjects to make sure nobody got hurt or exploited. The proposal had to explain the study design, potential risks, how he would protect participant privacy, and what scientific value the research offered. Then the board would meet to discuss it and either approve, request changes, or deny it. He also needed to apply for grant funding since the equipment and lab time cost money. The whole process could take weeks or even months. My stomach felt heavy hearing the timeline. I had been hoping for fast answers, some way to fix this quickly. But he assured me that even this preliminary consultation gave him enough material to start writing the proposal. He would move as fast as the system allowed. After we ended the video call, I immediately messaged Casey with everything Dr. Holmes had said. I typed out his hypothesis about effective recognition circuits and the study design with EMG sensors and eye tracking. Casey responded within minutes saying this was exciting progress. But then she added a warning. Research moved slowly through institutional channels. Even if Dr. Holmes got approval and funding, collecting data and publishing results would take months or years. That timeline would not solve my immediate problems with housing, employment, and daily survival. She suggested I also pursue legal options for the job loss, and maybe look into disability claims while waiting for the scientific side to develop. Her practical advice cut through my hope, but she was right. Scientific validation would not pay my rent next month. I opened a new browser tab and searched for employment lawyers in my area. Most websites showed generic corporate headshots and vague promises about fighting for workers' rights. Then I found Florence Weaver's site, which specifically mentioned discrimination cases involving medical conditions. Her bio said she had won settlements for people fired due to disabilities, chronic illnesses, and conditions that made employers uncomfortable. I clicked the contact form and started typing. I explained the car accident, the 30 seconds of unconsciousness, how everyone who knew me before perceived my face as different, even though photos showed no change. I described the security incident at work, my boss suggesting I take leave, the whispers from coworkers, and finally my termination. I attached my termination letter, the security report, emails from my boss, and before and after photos of my face. Then I hit send before I could second guess whether this was worth trying. Florence responded the next morning asking if I could do a phone consultation that afternoon. During the call, she let me talk for 20 minutes straight without interrupting once. I went through the entire timeline from the accident to losing my job. When I finished, she asked specific questions. What exact reason did my employer give for termination? Did they document anything about my appearance in writing? Did anyone use words like threatening, disturbing, or concerning in reference to how I looked? Were there performance reviews before the accident I could share? Her questions felt different from Dr. Holmes's scientific curiosity. She was building a legal case, looking for documentation and specific language she could use. Both approaches felt like people actually trying to help instead of dismissing me as crazy. Florence explained her legal strategy. If we could establish this as a neurological condition affecting how others perceived me, we might have grounds for an ADA claim or an EEOC complaint. The Americans with Disabilities Act protected people from discrimination based on disabilities. Usually that meant the disabled person could not perform their job. But in my case, the disability primarily affected observers, rather than me directly. My employer discriminated against me because other people's brains malfunctioned when looking at me. The legal logic seemed complicated and backwards, but Florence sounded confident it could work. She had handled cases where employers fired people for making customers uncomfortable due to medical conditions. This was similar. Her confidence made me feel slightly less powerless for the first time since the accident. She asked me to compile a detailed timeline of everything related to my employment. She wanted the security incident documented with exact dates and times. Conversations with my boss, even informal ones, needed to be written down with as much detail as I could remember. My termination meeting required a minute-by-minute account of what was said. She needed emails, text messages, any documentation I had saved. I spent the entire evening organizing 3 months of my life into a document. I found the email where my boss suggested I take time off. I screenshotted text messages from coworkers asking if I was okay. I wrote out the conversation where security would not let me in the building. I attached my performance reviews from before the accident showing good ratings. I included photos of my face from before and after. By midnight, I had a 15-page document with dozens of attachments showing exactly how my employer treated me differently after the accident. While putting together the legal timeline, I realized I should document the observer effect more carefully. Dr. Holmes needed specific descriptions of what people perceived as wrong. Florence needed quotes showing the discrimination was based on appearance rather than performance. I decided to schedule coffee meetings with people who knew me before the accident and directly ask them to describe what seemed different. Maybe getting their exact words would help both the research and the legal case. I sent messages to 3 people I had been friendly with but not super close to. I figured they might be more willing to meet than my mom or ex-boyfriend. I asked each one if they would grab coffee and help me understand what changed. 2 responded yes within an hour. The third took 2 days but eventually agreed. The first meeting was with Evangeline Hansen, someone I had worked with in a different department. We had eaten lunch together sometimes and chatted about weekend plans. I picked a busy coffee shop hoping the crowd would make it less awkward. She walked in and scanned the room. When her eyes landed on me, her smile faltered. She recovered quickly and came over, but I saw that initial reaction. We ordered drinks and sat down. I thanked her for meeting me and explained I was trying to understand what people perceived as different. She shifted in her seat, looking uncomfortable. I asked her directly to describe what seemed wrong about my appearance now compared to before the accident. She struggled for words, starting and stopping several times. Finally, she said my expressions did not match what she remembered. When I smiled, it looked like the right smile, but something about it felt off. Like the timing was wrong or the muscles moved in a slightly different order. She could not explain it better than that. After we finished coffee, I went to my car and immediately typed her exact phrases into my phone. The second meeting was with Liam Burke, a guy from my gym who I used to chat with between sets. He had always been friendly, asking about my weekend or commenting on my progress with weights. I suggested meeting at a juice bar near the gym. He showed up in workout clothes like he planned to hit the gym after. When I waved, he walked over but kept more physical distance than he used to. We used to stand close enough to spot each other on exercises. Now he sat across the table with his chair pulled back. I asked him the same question about what seemed different. He thought for a minute, then said, "My face looked flat somehow, like a photograph instead of a real person. 3-dimensional but missing some quality that made it feel alive." He apologized for not being able to explain it better. The description was new and honestly disturbing. Nobody had used the word flat before. After he left, I added his exact words to my documentation file. The third meeting was with Nora Townsend, my former best friend who I had not seen since she said I looked like someone wearing my skin. She agreed to meet only in a public place and brought her boyfriend for support. I picked a busy coffee shop near the university where we used to study together. When I arrived early and grabbed a table in the corner, I saw them walk in together. Her boyfriend stayed close to her side as they approached. Nora sat down across from me but would not look directly at me. Her boyfriend sat next to her with his arm around her shoulders. I thanked them for coming and said I was trying to understand what people perceived as different. Nora's hands were shaking as she held her coffee cup. I asked her to be specific about the wrongness she saw when she looked at me. She started crying immediately. Her boyfriend squeezed her shoulder and asked if she wanted to leave, but she shook her head. She wiped her eyes and said my eyes did not connect with her anymore, like I was looking through her instead of at her. She said when we used to talk, she could see me seeing her, but now it felt like I was staring at empty space. The description made my stomach hurt, but I wrote down her exact words. After they left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, adding everything to my documentation file. I compiled all 3 descriptions along with earlier quotes from Armand, my mom, and others into a single document. The specific language was different in each case, but clear patterns showed up. Disconnect, flatness, wrongness in expressions or eye contact rather than actual features. Nobody described a different nose or changed bone structure. They all focused on movement, connection, the feeling of looking at me. I organized the quotes by category and highlighted the repeated themes. Then I sent the compilation to both Florence and Holmes, hoping it would help their different approaches to my situation. Holmes responded within an hour. His email said the consistent focus on effective and dynamic features, rather than static facial structure, strongly supported his hypothesis about disrupted emotional recognition circuits. He asked permission to quote some descriptions anonymously in his IRB proposal. I wrote back immediately saying yes and offering to provide more documentation if needed. I was glad my suffering might actually contribute to understanding this thing that was happening to hundreds of people. Florence used the quotes differently in her response the next day. She highlighted how none of them described actual physical changes that would justify employment termination. My former coworkers said I looked flat or disconnected, not that I had a different face. She drafted an EEOC intake form arguing I was discriminated against due to others' neurological responses to a medical condition I had. The legal framing felt strange but potentially powerful. She was redefining the problem as their perception issue, not my appearance issue, which was exactly what Holmes was trying to prove scientifically. Casey messaged me that evening about an upcoming video call with several support group members who had been dealing with this for over a year. She thought hearing their coping strategies might help me manage the practical realities while waiting for research and legal processes to move forward. I agreed to join, curious about how others had survived this for so long. The group video call happened 2 days later and included 5 people from different states. Everyone had similar stories, starting with minor accidents and 30 seconds of unconsciousness. A woman named Aurora Hale had rebuilt her entire life in a new city where nobody knew her before the accident. She worked remotely and had made all new friends using only post-accident photos. A man named Galen Curtis still lived near his family, but only communicated through text messages and phone calls now. He had not seen his parents face-to-face in 8 months. Their strategies ranged from complete geographical escape to careful boundary management with people who used to know them. During the call, Duncan Moore shared that he tried exposure therapy with his wife. Gradual, structured interactions designed to help her brain recalibrate to his post-accident appearance. They worked with a therapist for 6 months doing exercises where she looked at him for increasing amounts of time. After all that work, she could tolerate being in the same room, but still could not look directly at him. The story was heartbreaking, but honest about the limits of what might be possible. Duncan said he was considering moving to a different state to start over, because watching his wife struggle to look at him was destroying both of them. Aurora talked about the unexpected freedom of starting over where nobody had pre-accident expectations of her. She had made new friends who only knew her current face. She started dating someone who never knew the old her. She built a career using recent photos for all professional purposes. Her success was inspiring, but also made clear how much I would have to give up to achieve similar stability. She said leaving behind her family and old friends were the hardest thing she ever did, but she finally felt like a real person again, instead of a ghost haunting her own life. After the call ended, I sat with the 2 options they had presented: run away and start fresh, or stay and fight to maintain some connection to my old life. Neither option felt good. Running meant admitting defeat and abandoning my mom, my apartment, everything familiar. Staying meant ongoing rejection and having to prove my identity constantly. I did not decide yet, just sat with the impossible choice while my laptop screen went dark. The next morning, I tried to go to my bank to access my safety deposit box where I kept some old jewelry and important documents. The teller looked at my ID and then at me and said the photo did not match my face. I insisted it was me and provided my account number, social security number, and answers to 3 security questions. She called her manager over. The manager took my ID and examined it under a special light, comparing it to me multiple times. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She said they needed to verify my identity through additional means before granting access to the safety deposit box. I asked what additional means, and she said I would need to provide supplementary documentation, like a birth certificate or passport. I felt my face getting hot with anger and embarrassment as other customers in line stared at me. The manager handed back my ID and suggested I return another day with more documentation. I left the bank without accessing my own safety deposit box, adding another situation to the growing list of places where I could not prove I was myself. I went home and spent 3 hours digging through my filing cabinet for every piece of documentation I owned. Birth certificate from the bottom drawer, old photos from the shoebox in my closet, utility bills from the past year, credit card statements going back 6 months. I spread everything across my kitchen table and photographed each document with my phone before putting them in a folder. The next morning, I returned to the bank with the folder tucked under my arm and my jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt. The same teller called the same manager, and they both examined my documents one by one under that special light. The manager made copies of everything while I stood there watching other customers glance at me and then look away quickly. After 2 hours of this, they finally walked me to the safety deposit box room and unlocked my box, but the manager said they were flagging my account for additional verification requirements on all future visits. I wanted to scream at both of them, but instead I just took my grandmother's ring and the deed to my car from the box and left without saying anything. When I got home, there was an email waiting from someone named Jeremy Kane. He said he was a journalist covering human interest stories for a regional news outlet, and he had heard about my situation through community sources. He wanted to interview me about the phenomenon of post-accident recognition changes. My first reaction was to delete it and block his address, but then I stopped with my finger hovering over the delete button. Maybe media coverage would make people take this seriously. Maybe if enough people read about it, someone in power would actually do something to help us instead of treating us like we were crazy or lying. I saved the email and sat staring at it for 10 minutes trying to decide what to do. I forwarded Jeremy's email to Casey and Florence asking what they thought about doing an interview. Casey responded within an hour, warning me that media coverage could go really badly. She said journalists often went for sensational angles that made us look like freaks. She said comment sections were brutal and people would say terrible things. She said I would lose what little privacy I had left. Florence's response came later that evening and was more measured. She said media coverage could potentially help the legal case by documenting the discrimination publicly and creating a record that this condition existed. But she also warned that it might make my former employer defensive and harder to negotiate with. Neither of them gave me a clear yes or no answer, so I just sat with the decision for 2 days. I kept opening Jeremy's email and reading it over and over. I looked up his previous articles online and found mostly softball pieces about local business owners and community events. Nothing that seemed mean or exploitative, but also nothing that showed he could handle something this complicated with the seriousness it deserved. On the third day, I finally responded, agreeing to an interview, but I set strict ground rules. No photos of me. No identifying details about my employer or where I lived. I got to review all quotes before publication and could veto anything I was not comfortable with. Jeremy agreed to everything so fast it made me suspicious about what his real motives were, but I scheduled the interview anyway for that weekend at a coffee shop downtown. The interview happened on Saturday afternoon, and Jeremy was younger than I expected. He looked like he had just graduated from journalism school maybe a year ago. He had a notebook and a digital recorder, and he asked if it was okay to record our conversation. I said yes, and he started with basic questions about the timeline of the accident, and when I first noticed people reacting strangely. He asked about the medical consultations and what doctors had said. He asked about the social impact and how my relationships had changed. His questions were good, and he seemed genuinely interested, but I could tell the thing he was most excited about was the uncanny valley aspect. He kept coming back to how people who loved me now found me disturbing to look at. He asked me to describe their exact reactions and the specific words they used. His focus on that angle made me uncomfortable, but I answered honestly because I had agreed to the interview. During our conversation, Jeremy started using phrases that made my skin crawl. He said it was like body snatchers. He compared my experience to the invasion of the body snatchers phenomenon. He kept making references to science fiction movies and horror stories. I pushed back and told him this was a real neurological condition affecting real people, not some horror movie plot. I said we were not aliens or pod people, we were just regular humans whose brains got damaged in accidents. He nodded and wrote everything down, but I could see in his eyes that the sensational angle was what really excited him about the story. I left the coffee shop feeling like I had made a huge mistake. A week later, Jeremy's article went live on the news outlet's website. The headline was, "When Everyone You Love Sees a Stranger, the 30-second unconsciousness phenomenon." I read through the whole thing twice. The article itself was reasonably balanced. He included Dr. Holmes's hypothesis about disrupted recognition circuits. He quoted me accurately about the practical difficulties with banks and employers and housing. He mentioned the support group and the fact that hundreds of people were dealing with this. But the comment section started filling up within minutes of publication, and they were brutal. People called it fake. People said I was lying for attention. Someone compared me to aliens wearing human skin. Someone else made a joke about what I really looked like under my face. There were a few sympathetic comments from people saying they had similar experiences or knew someone who did, but those got buried under hundreds of skeptical and mocking responses. I made the mistake of reading through all of them. Each comment felt like it was chipping away at whatever sense of self I had left. People speculated about whether the accident had actually disfigured me, and I was in denial. People wondered if this was an elaborate hoax for a book deal or movie rights. People shared their theories about what psychological condition I really had. A few people were kind, but their kindness got drowned out by all the cruelty and mockery. I finally closed my laptop and did not open it again for 2 days. Casey sent me a message through the support group forum asking if I was okay. She said several group members had seen the article and were worried about me. I admitted I regretted doing the interview and wished I could take back the public exposure. She was kind, but she did not sugarcoat anything. She said the internet was forever, and I would need to develop thicker skin if I wanted to advocate for recognition of this condition. She said going public always came with a cost, and I had just paid it. Florence called me that same afternoon with an update on the EECC filing. She had submitted the initial intake form with all my documentation, and we should hear back within a few weeks about whether they would investigate. She mentioned that Jeremy's article might actually help by establishing a public record of the condition's existence, even if the comments were harsh. She said having media coverage showed this was not just me making things up, and that could be useful in legal proceedings. Her practical view helped me feel slightly less stupid about agreeing to the interview, but I still wished I could go back and delete Jeremy's original email before I ever responded to it. Dr. Holmes sent an email 2 days later with the subject line IRB proposal submitted. I opened it while sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee, and felt a small lift in my chest when I read that he was cautiously optimistic about approval. The review process would take 4 to 6 weeks according to his email, which felt like forever when I was living in this strange limbo of being unrecognized. He also mentioned he had seen Jeremy's article, and while the framing was sensationalist, it might actually help with public awareness and future funding opportunities for research. Everyone kept telling me the article was somehow good, despite how terrible reading those comments had felt, and I wanted to believe them, but mostly I just felt exposed and raw. I closed the email and tried to focus on the fact that the research was moving forward, even if it was moving slowly. The next afternoon, I found a certified letter notice in my mailbox and had to sign for the actual letter at the post office. My hands shook a little as I opened the envelope in my car and read that my landlord had received complaints from other tenants about an unauthorized person in my apartment. The letter demanded I provide proof of identity and lease rights within 10 days or face eviction proceedings. I read it 3 times trying to make sense of how this was happening when I had lived in that apartment for 3 years and paid rent on time every single month without missing once. Now I was treated like an intruder in my own home by a landlord who had cashed my rent checks for years. I sat in the car staring at the letter until my vision blurred and I had to blink hard to clear my eyes. I drove straight home and scanned the letter with my phone, then emailed it to Florence with a message asking if this was even legal. She responded within an hour saying it was likely discriminatory, and we should respond with a comprehensive identity packet plus a letter threatening legal action if the eviction proceeded. She said she would draft the response letter that evening, and I should start assembling every piece of documentation I had proving I was the legal tenant. I spent the rest of the day pulling files from my cabinet and folders from my desk, making copies of everything that had my name and address on it. My lease agreement, 3 years of rent payment records, utility bills going back to when I moved in, bank statements showing the automatic payments, renter's insurance policy, everything I could find that proved this was my home. Florence sent me her draft letter by 9 that night, and it was 3 pages of legal language basically saying my landlord was violating fair housing laws and disability discrimination statutes. I added it to my growing pile of documents along with my driver's license copy, birth certificate, social security card, and a stack of old photos showing me in the apartment. Florence had also included a notarized statement on her law firm letterhead, confirming she was representing me, and any eviction attempt would result in immediate legal action. The whole packet was over 40 pages when I finished assembling it, which felt absurd but also necessary given how my life had become an endless cycle of proving my own identity. I hand-delivered everything to my landlord's office the next morning, and made him sign a receipt confirming he had received it. He barely looked at me while he signed, just took the thick envelope and nodded without saying anything. The whole interaction took less than 2 minutes but left me feeling humiliated and angry that I had to prove I was myself just to keep the apartment I had been living in for years. I walked back to my car and sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down before driving home. That same afternoon, I got another email from Dr. Holmes saying his IRB proposal had received preliminary approval, but the board wanted additional safeguards for participant privacy and consent. He needed to revise and resubmit the proposal, which would add another 3 to 4 weeks to the timeline. I felt disappointed reading that, even though I knew research and bureaucracy both moved slowly, and nothing about this whole situation had been quick or easy. I sent him a short reply saying I understood and thanked him for keeping me updated, then closed my laptop and tried not to think about how many more weeks I would be waiting for any kind of scientific validation. Casey organized another support group video call 3 days later, this time focused specifically on documentation strategies and legal rights. 8 people joined the call, including me, and we spent over an hour sharing tips about what forms of ID worked best in different situations. Someone had success using their passport instead of a driver's license at banks. Another person said bringing multiple forms of ID together helped more than just one. We talked about how to handle law enforcement encounters without getting arrested for providing false identification when you were actually telling the truth. We shared which institutions were most difficult to deal with, and everyone agreed the DMV and banks were the worst. The collective knowledge was incredibly practical, and made me feel less alone in navigating these bureaucratic nightmares that seemed designed to trap people like us. During the call, a woman named Ivy Bowers mentioned she had success getting a letter from her neurologist, explaining her condition in medical terms, which she carried with her ID everywhere. She said several banks and government offices had accepted the medical letter as supplementary proof of identity when her appearance did not match her photos. Other people on the call started asking questions about what the letter said and how she convinced her doctor to write it. Ivy explained she had been working with a neurologist for 6 months on her case, and he was willing to document her situation, even though there was no official diagnosis yet. I immediately sent a message to Dr. Holmes after the call, asking if he would be willing to write something similar for me. Dr. Holmes responded the next morning, saying he could not officially diagnose a condition that had not been formally recognized by medical institutions yet, but he could write a letter describing the phenomenon and confirming I was under his care as a research participant. It was not perfect, but it was something official looking on medical letterhead that might help with identity verification issues. He said he would draft the letter and send it to me within 2 days. I thanked him and felt a small sense of relief that I would have one more piece of documentation to carry around with me. The letter arrived in my email exactly 2 days later, and I printed it out, then took 3 copies to a notary public to get them all notarized, so they would look as official as possible. My driver's license was up for renewal the following week, so I decided to test out the medical letter at the DMV. I brought my current license, the renewal notice, my birth certificate, and Dr. Holmes's notarized letter explaining I was a research participant in a study about post-accident recognition changes. The clerk took my current license and looked at the photo, then looked at me, then back at the photo. She read through Dr. Holmes's letter twice very slowly, moving her lips while she read. Then she called over a supervisor who did the same examination routine with my documents. They talked quietly to each other for about 15 minutes, while I stood there feeling my face get hot with embarrassment. Finally, the supervisor said they would process my renewal, but it needed to be flagged for secondary facial verification review. I left with a temporary paper license and instructions to return in 30 days to pick up my permanent card if the review cleared. My mom texted me for the first time in 2 weeks that evening asking if we could talk on the phone. I called her right away and she answered on the second ring. She started crying almost immediately and apologized for not being able to handle this situation better. She said she knew intellectually I was her daughter and she loved me, but every time she looked at me, her brain screamed that something was wrong. She described it like her eyes were showing her one thing, but her emotions were telling her something completely different. The honesty was painful, but it also helped me understand she was not choosing to reject me on purpose. Her neurological response was involuntary, something happening in her brain that she could not control no matter how much she wanted to. I asked if she would be willing to participate in Ibrahim's study once it got approved, thinking that having her brain responses measured might help both of us understand what was happening. She was quiet for a long time, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. She said she would think about it, that the idea of being studied made her uncomfortable, but she wanted to find a way back to me even if her brain was fighting against it. We agreed to try a phone-only relationship for now, talking a few times a week without the stress of her having to look at me. After we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling both relieved and sad that my relationship with my mom had been reduced to disembodied voices. The next morning, Florence sent an email with the subject line EEOC update, and I opened it so fast I almost dropped my phone. She wrote that the EECC had agreed to investigate my employment discrimination claim, and they were sending a questionnaire to my former employer and would interview relevant parties. The process would take months, but it was moving forward. She added a paragraph cautioning me not to expect a massive settlement or dramatic vindication, explaining that most cases like this ended in modest compensation and neutral references. I read the email 3 times, feeling a small spark of hope that someone official was taking my situation seriously. That afternoon, I started applying for remote work positions using my recent photos and planning to do video interviews, figuring that if I could get hired by people who never knew me before, I would not face the recognition issue. I updated my resume, created profiles on 3 different job sites, and spent the rest of the week submitting applications for data analysis and research positions. Within a week, I had landed 3 interviews for contract positions. The first interview was with a marketing analytics firm, and the hiring manager asked normal questions about my experience and skills without any weird reactions to my face. The second interview was similar, and by the third one, I realized Aurora was right about strangers not perceiving anything wrong with me. The interviewers all treated me like a regular job candidate, making eye contact and smiling and asking follow-up questions about my background. I accepted a remote contract position doing data analysis for a marketing firm after they offered it to me 2 days after my final interview. The pay was decent enough to cover my rent and bills, and the work was entirely virtual with no office requirements. My new boss, Cole Herrera, was friendly and professional during our video onboarding session, walking me through the company systems and introducing me to the team members one by one. He showed no signs of finding me disturbing or wrong, just treated me like any other new employee. During our first team meeting, when everyone was introducing themselves and welcoming me, I felt tears starting in my eyes because being treated normally in a professional setting was such a relief. I had to turn off my camera for a minute to pull myself together before rejoining the meeting. With my income stabilized, I started thinking seriously about whether to stay in the city or relocate like Aurora had done. I pulled out a notebook and made a pros and cons list, writing staying at the top of one column and moving at the top of the other. Staying meant potential reconciliation with my mom if the study helped her brain adjust, and it meant maintaining my legal cases with Florence and the EEOC investigation. But it also meant ongoing encounters with people who knew me before, like running into former co-workers at the grocery store or seeing my old neighbors who thought I was a stranger. Moving meant a clean start where no one had pre-accident memories of me, but it also meant abandoning any hope of recovering my old relationships and leaving behind the only city I had ever lived in. I stared at the list for an hour without making a decision, then closed the notebook and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Ibrahim sent me an email with the subject line, IRB approval, and I opened it immediately. His revised proposal had been approved by the University Ethics Board, and he wanted to schedule the first round of testing as soon as possible. The study would involve bringing in people who knew me before the accident and measuring their brain responses to my face compared to control subjects who had never met me. He needed me to recruit participants, which meant asking my mom, former coworkers, and maybe even Armand to undergo testing. The thought of asking Armand made me feel sick to my stomach, imagining him saying no or using it as another opportunity to tell me I was not really me. I decided to start with my mom, calling her that evening and explaining that the study might help researchers understand and eventually treat the condition. She listened quietly while I described the testing process and what Ibrahim hoped to learn from it. After a long pause, she agreed to participate, saying she would do anything that might help her see me as her daughter again. Ibrahim sent her the consent forms and scheduled her for the following week. I thought about reaching out to Armand, but could not bring myself to do it yet, the emotional risk of his refusal feeling too high to handle. The first testing session with my mom happened at Ibrahim's university lab on a Tuesday morning. I drove her there and walked her to the neuroscience building, but Ibrahim told me I was not allowed in the room during her testing. I sat in the waiting area for 2 hours while they ran facial EMG, eye tracking, and fMRI scans, flipping through old magazines without reading them and checking my phone every few minutes. When my mom finally emerged, she looked exhausted and drained, her face pale and her movements slow. She said the process was painless, just strange to stare at photos of me while machines measured her reactions. We went to get coffee afterward, and she held my hand across the table, even though she could barely look at my face. Ibrahim called me the next day to brief me on the preliminary data, and I put him on speaker while I took notes. He explained that my mom's amygdala and fusiform face area activated normally when viewing my face, which meant her brain was recognizing me correctly at the basic level. But her anterior cingulate cortex showed unusual activity patterns that suggested emotional conflict. In simpler terms, her brain recognized my face correctly, but flagged it as emotionally wrong. The data validated what she had been describing all along, that her brain was betraying her feelings about me through some kind of neurological glitch. Over the next 3 weeks, Ibrahim tested 4 more people who knew me before the accident. 2 former coworkers agreed to participate after I sent them careful emails explaining the research, and my old roommate said yes after some hesitation. Evangeline came in for testing too, and each time I sat in that same waiting area, while machines measured how their brains responded to my face. All 4 showed similar patterns of normal facial recognition in the basic processing areas, but disrupted effective processing in the emotional recognition circuits. The consistency across participants strengthened Ibrahim's theory that the accident had triggered something in observers' emotional recognition systems, rather than changing anything about my actual face. Ibrahim scheduled a consultation 2 days later to walk me through what the testing data actually meant. I sat in his office while he pulled up brain scans and graphs on his computer screen, pointing to colored areas that showed different levels of activity. He started by saying this was all preliminary and would need peer review and replication before any formal conclusions. But the patterns across all 5 participants were consistent enough to suggest something real was happening. The data showed that when people who knew me before the accident looked at my face, their basic facial recognition areas lit up normally. The fusiform face area and the parts of their brains responsible for identifying faces worked exactly as they should. But the anterior cingulate cortex, which handles emotional recognition and the feeling of familiarity you get when you see someone you know, showed unusual activity patterns. Ibrahim explained it like this. Their brains recognized my face correctly at the visual processing level, but something in the emotional recognition circuit was flagging it as wrong or unfamiliar. He called it a form of acquired prosopagnosia for emotional recognition, meaning they could identify my face cognitively, but couldn't access the warm familiarity that normally comes with seeing someone they love. The scientific language made it feel less like I was a monster, and more like a medical phenomenon that could be studied and potentially understood. I asked Ibrahim if there was any treatment or intervention that might help people recalibrate their responses to me. He leaned back in his chair and admitted we didn't know yet, because this was the first systematic study of the phenomenon. Exposure therapy might help some people gradually retrain their emotional recognition circuits, but he couldn't make any promises about effectiveness or timeline. Some people might never recover the emotional recognition no matter how much exposure they got. The uncertainty was hard to hear, but at least now there was scientific documentation proving this was real, and not just in my head. I left his office with copies of the preliminary findings and a strange mix of validation and disappointment. 3 days later, Florence called with an update on the EECC investigation. My former employer had responded to the inquiry, and their official position was that they terminated me due to performance issues and cultural fit concerns completely unrelated to my appearance. Florence said this was standard defensive strategy when employers face discrimination claims, and we had evidence that contradicted their narrative. My performance reviews had been consistently positive right up until the accident, and multiple witnesses could confirm the security incident was the triggering event for my termination. The investigation would continue with witness interviews and document review over the next few months. Florence estimated another 2 to 3 months before we'd get any resolution, and even then, it might just be a settlement offer, rather than a formal finding. I thanked her and tried not to feel discouraged about how slowly everything moved. Jeremy Kane emailed me the following week asking for a follow-up interview about Ibrahim's research findings. My first reaction was to delete the message after the comment section disaster from his first article, but I hesitated and forwarded it to Ibrahim instead. He responded within an hour saying that peer-reviewed publication was still months away, and media coverage might actually help other affected people find the support group and participate in research. He encouraged me to do the interview, but suggested I set even stricter guidelines about scientific accuracy and avoid any sensationalist framing. I replied to Jeremy agreeing to a second interview with conditions. He had to run all scientific claims past Ibrahim for accuracy, no body snatcher comparisons or horror movie references, and I wanted to review the article before publication. He agreed to everything, and we scheduled a video call for the next day. The follow-up article ran 2 weeks later with a completely different tone from the first piece. Jeremy focused on Ibrahim's research and the neurological basis for the phenomenon, using proper scientific terminology and explaining the brain imaging findings in accessible language. He included quotes from me about the practical challenges of navigating daily life when people perceive you differently, but framed it as a medical condition rather than a creepy mystery. The comment section was still mixed with some skeptics and trolls, but more people shared their own experiences or expressed genuine sympathy for what I was going through. A few researchers even commented asking about Ibrahim's publication timeline and whether they could collaborate on expanding the study. The article felt like progress even if it didn't fix anything. The DMV secondary review finally completed, and I received my renewed license in the mail on a Tuesday morning. I opened the envelope with shaking hands and stared at the new card with my recent photo, the one that matched my current appearance even though I looked exactly the same as always. The validation date was current and the card looked official and legitimate. I immediately drove to a copy shop and got 3 certified copies made, then spent the rest of the day updating my license number on every account and database I could think of. Having current government-issued ID felt like reclaiming a piece of normal life, like I existed in the official record again as myself. My landlord sent a brief email that same week acknowledging receipt of my identity documentation and confirming my lease would be renewed under standard terms when it came up in 2 months. No apology for the stress he'd caused by threatening eviction, no acknowledgement that he'd treated me like an intruder in my own home, just bureaucratic confirmation that I could stay. I was angry about his behavior, but relieved the housing crisis was resolved without having to move or find a new apartment. I attended another support group video call that Friday and shared updates about Ibrahim's research progress and my stabilized employment and housing situation. Several members asked detailed questions about the study design and whether they could participate if Ibrahim expanded to other cities. Casey mentioned she was already in touch with him about recruiting participants from different locations to strengthen the research. The group's collective hope that scientific validation might lead to better understanding or treatment felt fragile but real, like we were all holding on to something that might actually help us eventually. 3 months after the accident, I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning taking inventory of my life. I had stable income from the remote contract work, secure housing with my lease renewal confirmed, a renewed driver's license with a current photo, and active legal and research cases documenting what had happened to me. My relationship with my mom existed only through phone calls and texts now, because she still couldn't look at me without her brain screaming that something was wrong. Armand was completely out of my life with no contact since the breakup. Most of my old friends had drifted away or stopped responding to messages. But I had new connections through the support group, people who understood exactly what I was going through because they were living it too. I had a remote job where colleagues treated me normally because they'd never known me before. I had documented scientific evidence from Ibrahim's study proving I wasn't crazy, or imagining the way people responded to me. The life I was building looked nothing like the one I'd had before the accident, but it was mine, and I was learning to live in it without needing everyone to see me the way I saw myself. That's where we'll stop today. Thanks for being here. It honestly makes these stories feel so much warmer. I hope you're leaving with a smile. Subscribe if you'd like to keep sharing these little moments together.